All right, welcome back. We're going to talk about the second version of the cosmological argument, the cosmological argument from contingency. Um, I want to sort of give you this little thought experiment to help you um, get in the mood, so to speak, for the main principle of this argument, the principle of sufficient reason. Um, so I want you to imagine that you are walking along through the arboretum. There's some nice trails that you might be accustomed to walking along many afternoons. Imagine you've done this, every afternoon after your afternoon class for a year, let's say, and you haven't really seen anything out of the ordinary. Um, every once in a while you pass another person and you wave. Sometimes you see a bird or something, but it's a very predictable walk, nothing too out of the ordinary. One day, though, you're walking along and you turn a corner, and boom, there's a badly photoshopped glowing orb that is about 6 feet across and about 6 feet tall and sort of hovering off the ground. It's, a few yards from you, and it's making this kind of humming sound, and you can sort of see leaves scattering beneath it. I want you to think to yourself, just briefly, pause the video if you want to, how would you react to discovering the orb along your walking trail? Now, let's imagine that it's not dangerous, and as far as you know, it's not going to hurt you. I think, let me just report how I would react. I think I'd be really, really curious. I would run through a list of questions, I think, very quickly in my mind after I sort of got over the initial fear, say, and double check to make sure, is this real? When I realized, yes, this is real, questions would occur to me like, what is this thing? And importantly, I think I would ask myself, where did this come from? And that question would occur pretty quickly to me, and I think it probably would occur to you, in part because of how novel it is. That is, you've been taking this walk every day for months, and you hadn't seen a glowing orb in your path. The fact that you now suddenly see this thing and it stands out from its surroundings, it wasn't there yesterday. So you have this sense of, this thing didn't have to be there. I know that for sure because it wasn't there yesterday. And yet here it is. This sense of, we have a being that exists, but at the same time, I know it didn't have to. That sense of curiosity that is naturally produced by this state of affairs is captured by the principle of sufficient reason. And really, the cosmological argument from contingency, it is another argument for God's existence, but it focuses primarily on this feature of the cosmos. From one perspective, the cosmos itself and all of its parts are not so different from the glowing orb in the woods. In the following sense, each material entity in the world and the world as a whole didn't have to be here. And the fact that they didn't have to be here, and yet they are, cries out for explanation. We find ourselves wondering, well, then what produced it? What caused it to be rather than not? One way of putting this question is something like, why is there anything rather than nothing? Before we can lay out this argument in a more formal way, let's just define a few terms, because here I am going to be departing a little bit from your author, William Rowe, who I think gives a very clear presentation of one version of this argument. He relies on the notion of a self-existent being and the notion of an independent being. I'm going to try to sort of sidestep those ideas, in part because I think the way that the philosopher Leibniz and to some degree Clarke thought of this argument is more faithfully represented using the notions of contingency and necessity as opposed to independence. So while the row reading you should definitely do, and I think that it provides you with an overview of the big picture of how this argument is structured, I do want you to know the particular way of setting up the argument that I'll be presenting in this video. The idea of a contingent being is the idea of a being that exists but possibly does not exist. Now, it's important that the idea of possibly here is not like a being whose existence you're uncertain of. Sometimes we use the word possibly to mean I'm not sure. That's not the sense of possibility at issue here. Instead, another way to put it is a contingent being is a being that exists but didn't have to. So, for example, my grandpa, Hugh Bailey, was a World War II veteran, and he did see combat, although he told us, his family members, that he really didn't. We found out after he died that, in fact, he did see very real combat, and he came quite close to death. In fact, he saw a friend of his who was standing right next to him just get blown apart by incoming fire. Now, he made it out of the war, but clearly, to some degree, it was a matter of chance that he made it out of the war, but his friend didn't. I mean, had the wind been shifted a little bit differently that day, the shell might have landed on him as opposed to his friend. Or had there been one or two additional gunmen shooting down on them, one of them might have struck him. The fact that he made it out, therefore, is a highly contingent state of affairs. Now, notice that has really radical implications for the existence of other beings. So, for example, if my grandpa hadn't made it out of the war, my grandma, whom he met after the war, would have perhaps gone on to marry someone else. Had she done that, my mother wouldn't have been born. Perhaps there would have been a similar looking person born at roughly the same time who would have been there instead of my mother. But that wouldn't have been my mom. And of course, had my mom not existed, then who knows what would have happened with my dad, but he certainly wouldn't have met her because she didn't exist. And so I wouldn't have existed. Again, perhaps there would be some other very vaguely similar looking person who would have existed instead, but that wouldn't have been me. You know, you can probably, I'm sure, tell a similar kind of story based on the contingencies and the randomness that happen to lead to your being here now and watching this video. And indeed, the fact that you exist at all is a bit of a random coincidence, or a bit of a matter of random chance. This is the sense of contingency that's at issue in the contingency cosmological argument. It's really important that this notion of contingency is not confused with a different idea, which is the notion of dependence. We will use that idea, but they are distinct concepts. So sometimes colloquially we'll say, my existence is contingent on my parents' existence. That is just a different use of the word contingent. That is more like dependence. When I say contingent and when you think contingent, think exists but didn't have to. Okay, the contrast concept, the opposite concept, is the idea of a necessary being. The idea of a necessary being is defined as a being that exists but does not possibly not exist. So you can see that a necessary being is defined as the negation of a contingent being. A contingent being exists but possibly does not, whereas a necessary being exists but does not possibly not. Now, another way to put the idea of a necessary being is a being whose existence, would have existed no matter what. or a being who didn't just happen to exist, but regardless of how things could possibly have gone, the necessary being would have been. If there is a necessary being, that being would have existed even if my grandpa hadn't existed. That being would have existed even if my mom hadn't existed. The necessary being would have existed even if I hadn't existed. Indeed, more generally, the necessary being would have existed even if there had been nothing else at all. For example, no material universe. We can give lots of examples of contingent beings. So I mentioned each of us, and indeed every human being there is. This book, here's a book, Contingent Being. It exists, but it didn't have to. There's a chair over there, contingent being. The earth itself, perhaps the universe itself, contingent beings. It's much harder to put your hands on an uncontroversial example of a necessary being. However, the theist is going to argue for the conclusion that there is a necessary being. And the main example historically of a necessary being is God. Now, you can sort of see why theists have traditionally thought that if they can establish that there's a necessary being, then they've shown that God exists. God is supposed to be one of the central qualities of the God of classical theism, is a being whose existence is stable, so to speak. This being, by its very nature, exists. Its existence is not subject to random processes that could have turned out differently. In that sense, if there's a necessary being, that is one of the defining features of the God of classical theism. So the conclusion of the argument from contingency for the existence of God, as we'll see, is really there is a necessary being. Okay, here's the other definition that we'll need to have sort of in our back pocket before we lay out this argument. This is the idea of a dependent being. A dependent being, crucially, is not defined the same way as a contingent being is defined. Instead, a dependent being is a being that's caused to exist by something outside of itself. If it's helpful, you can think of a dependent being as basically something like a being with an efficient cause. So the table is a dependent being because it was caused to exist by, let's say, in an idealized kind of case, a craftsman, right? More likely by a factory and perhaps some people on an assembly line. Each of us is a dependent being. I mean, in the last video, we talked about how each of us has an efficient cause. Each of us is caused to exist by something outside of ourselves. Now, we can start to put the pieces of the puzzle together. We've got, on the one hand, this idea of a contingent being, and then on the other hand, this idea of a dependent being. You might wonder, how are these related, if at all? I said that they're not the same definition, and that's important to keep in mind. But you might think it seems as though they go hand in hand in some way. Here is the early modern philosopher Leibniz, and he very much agrees that they go hand in hand. Here's what he says: no fact can hold or be real, and no proposition can be true unless there is a sufficient reason why it is so and not otherwise. This is an expression of the principle of sufficient reason, or what we'll just call the PSR. You know, Rowe gives a bit of an idiosyncratic formulation of the PSR in the piece I had you read. So I will just flag, I'm going to be formulating the PSR a little different than Rowe, and I think it sticks a bit closer to the way Leibniz thinks of it. The PSR says this: every contingent being has a cause outside of itself. What the PSR says is, if there's a being that exists but didn't have to, then there is something outside of that being that brought it into existence. We can swap out this phrase, has a cause outside of itself, for the notion of a dependent being. Remember, a dependent being is just one that has a cause outside of itself. So what the PSR really says, a shortened version, is this: every contingent being is dependent. So earlier I said surely there's some relationship between being contingent and being dependent. The principle of sufficient reason says every single being that's contingent is also a dependent being. The two concepts may not be interdefinable, but wherever we look, if we find a being that exists but didn't have to, we also find, oh, what do you know? It has a cause outside of itself. Now, just really briefly, why should you believe the PSR? I think that one reason to accept at least this version of the PSR is just the idea that any contingent being that you encounter in everyday life, or that anyone ever finds in scientific inquiry, any being where you're like, oh, that exists today but didn't exist yesterday, always depends for its existence on something else. So I started with this idea of finding this thought experiment of finding the orb in the woods. The sense you have when you encounter the orb in the woods that you know didn't exist yesterday is the thought, this had to come from somewhere. Something outside of this must have brought it into existence. And then you start wondering, well, I wonder what kind of thing brought it, for what reason, and so on. You never, ever encounter such a thing and think, well, there's just no reason. It just is. That never occurs to you. The principle of sufficient reason explains why. That never occurs to you. And the principle of sufficient reason, therefore, it gains a kind of inductive support from everyday experience. Everything we've encountered that is contingent is also dependent. That is a huge sample size and really good reason to think, well, maybe it's a kind of deep law of reality, something even sort of stronger than a law of nature, that every contingent being is dependent. We can now lay out the argument. The conclusion of the argument is, therefore, there is a necessary being. And we're going to come back to the question of why this is supposed to be God a little bit later. The first premise of the argument, CC1, is this: either every being is dependent, or there's a necessary being. Either every being is dependent, or there is a necessary being. The second premise is this: not every being is dependent, or it's not the case that every single being there is caused to exist by something outside of itself. Conclusion, therefore, there's a necessary being. Okay, what are our two questions whenever we encounter a philosophical argument? Question one, is this logically valid? And then question two, is it sound? As for logical validity, this is easy. Last time we spent quite a bit of time walking through trying to reconstruct a valid version of Aquinas' first cause argument. This version of the cosmological argument, we can tell straight away, is definitely valid. CC1 gives us two options. In other words, what CC1 asserts, whether it's true or not, we'll come back to, what it claims is that at least one of the following is true. Every being there is dependent, or there's at least one necessary being. The second premise comes in and says, but not every being is dependent. So that first option is not the case. Conclusion, therefore, the option that has not been eliminated is the one that's true. There is a necessary being. You can think of this as a process of elimination argument. One gives us two options, second premise eliminates one of the options, and the conclusion affirms the remaining option. In logic, this is sometimes called a disjunctive syllogism, and it's a valid argument form. Now, the follow-up question then is, well, great, it's valid, but that's not worth much. I mean, why should I believe these premises? Let's start with the first premise. The first premise just says, hey, you've only got two options. Either every being is dependent or there's a necessary being. You might be like, why are those the only two options? We're going to give a quick little defense of the first premise. The first step of the defense of premise one, here's what the theist will say. Look, either every being is contingent or there's a necessary being. Either every being is contingent or there's a necessary being. Now, the first step here, notice, is swapping out for that first option. Instead of the option one being every being is dependent, option one is now every being is contingent. The reason this substitution is important is that it is true by definition. It is trivially logically true that either every being that exists is contingent or there's a necessary being. Why? Well, remember that a contingent being and a necessary being are defined as logical opposites. So a contingent being is one that exists but possibly does not exist, and a necessary being is one that exists and does not possibly not exist. So of course it's true, trivially, that either every being that exists but didn't have to, or exists but is not the case that it didn't have to exist. In that sense, there is no other option there except either every being is contingent or there's a necessary being. Those are the only two possibilities. Now, the second step invokes the principle of sufficient reason, which we discussed earlier. The PSR says every contingent being is dependent. When you put steps 1 and 2 together, the conclusion, therefore, either every being is dependent or there's a necessary being, does logically follow. Remember that step 1 said either every being is contingent or there's a necessary being. The PSR says every contingent being is dependent, so either every being is dependent or there's a necessary being. We're going to mostly set aside that defensive premise 1. The only controversial step there is the second one, which is the PSR, or the only even debatable step. The first step is just true by definition. The second step is the principle of sufficient reason, and what we'll see is that the principle of sufficient reason also has to be used in defense of the second premise. So when I mentioned that the principle of sufficient reason is the driving engine behind this argument, that's why. It shows up as a principle that is relied upon at both the first and the second step of the argument. The more interesting premise here is really not every being is dependent. You might be like, I just don't know why it has to be the case that not every being is dependent. I mean, why couldn't it be that every single being is a dependent being? I mean, wouldn't that effectively be our infinite series that we encountered last time? Each being has an efficient cause in terms of a being before it. The defense that the theist is going to give of the claim that not every being is dependent is going to rely on an observation about the collection of all of the things that there are in the material world. The theist will invite us to, in our mind's eye, think of each and every one of the existing objects that there are, specifically each and every one of the contingent existing objects. So earlier I mentioned that you and I are contingent things. Group us together in your mind's eye. Add in, I've got a water bottle over here. Add in a water bottle. That's also a contingent thing. I've got a bunch of pencils. Those are all part of the collection. And so on. Anything that's contingent is part of this, what we'll call collection C. Now finally add in every other contingent being there ever will be or ever was. This is an abstraction, but it's a useful one, I think. Let's now just give a name to this abstract set or group. And this is collection C. So collection C is the complete collection of all contingent beings that there are, ever were, or ever will be. Here is the first step of the theist's defense of the claim that not every being is dependent. The theist says, okay, we've got this idea of collection C. It's just a name of a grouping or collection of all the contingent beings there are. Their first claim is collection C is contingent. Now notice that here they're not claiming that any individual member of the collection is contingent. They're claiming that the whole collection is a contingent thing. Why do they think this? Well, one reason they shouldn't think this is something like the following. Every whole inherits all of the properties had by its parts. Rowe discusses why that's not generally a good form of reasoning. But I think that there's a different way for the theist to arrive at the conclusion that collection C is contingent. Really briefly, you don't have to know this, but here's the idea. Collection C is made up entirely of things that exist but didn't have to exist. So let's consider that collection, and then now let's remove one item from it and destroy that item, again in our mind's eye. We know we can do that because every item in there is a contingent thing. Now, in a scenario where you have different members because you've destroyed one of the items and maybe added in a different one, you then have a new collection. In other words, by destroying one of the items that make up the collection, you have thereby destroyed the collection itself. It may be a very similar collection that you have at the end, but it's not the same one. I mean, think of it this way. If you have the Three Musketeers and then one of the Three Musketeers dies, you no longer have the Three Musketeers. That is, that collection of those three people no longer exists. You now have a new collection. You could call it, if you wanted, the Three Musketeers. But of course, that would be a misleading way of speaking. The original group no longer exists because one does not. That, I think, is a better line of reasoning in support of 2.1. 2.2 is this. The principle of sufficient reason is true. Every contingent being is dependent. Now, I mentioned that the principle of sufficient reason really does double duty in this argument. It functions as a crucial defense of premise 1, and now we see it reappearing in the defense of premise 2. Here's the third step, 2.3. Only contingent beings are dependent. Notice that this is not the same logically as the PSR. The PSR says every contingent being is dependent, and then 2.3 says only contingent beings are dependent. Being is not contingent, then it's not dependent either. What I want to invite you to do in the next few minutes of the video is to pause as I ask what follows. I think this will be, in a live version of this course, we sort of do this together in a live way, but the best maybe way to replicate that is for you to pause and maybe write down an answer and then check it against what I say as we go. Let's look at 2.1 and 2.2. 2.1 says collection C is contingent, and then 2.2 says every contingent being is dependent. What follows from those two? Well, if collection C is contingent and every contingent being is dependent, then I guess collection C is dependent. So over here on the right-hand side, we have justification lines. Those justification lines, you need to know those. That's telling you what follows from what, or which steps are being relied upon logically. So 2.4 follows from 2.1 and 2.2. Now, collection C is dependent. That is, that whole big collection of all contingent beings depends for its existence on something. What does it mean for a being to be dependent? Well, the way that was defined was A being is dependent when there's something outside of it that causes it to exist. So we can conclude now that if collection C is dependent, another way of putting that is that there's a being outside of collection C that causes collection C to exist. I mean, that's just true by definition. And so in 2.5, we're going to slot in, citing 2.4, just the definition of dependent being, or part of that definition. Therefore, there's a being X, we don't know what it is, that's outside of collection C. We could also add, if we wanted to, that causes C to exist. I'm just dropping that out for the sake of simplicity. Now, if there's a being X that's outside of C, which is what 2.5 tells us, what follows? In particular, what follows about the nature of the being that's outside of C? And here I want to draw your attention back to what collection C is, which is collection C is the complete collection of all contingent beings. Well, if there's something then outside of that collection, and we know that every single contingent being is in the collection, then whatever is outside the collection must not itself be contingent. Because if it were contingent, it would be inside the collection. So we can conclude, just from what we know about the definition of collection C, that there is a being, X, that is not contingent. So far what we have is there's this being that is outside of the collection of all contingent beings that's not itself a contingent being. Now that all by itself is an interesting conclusion. You're going to be tempted to now be like, well, so we just established that there's at least one necessary being. We could draw that inference if we wanted to, but keep in mind that right now our goal is just to establish that not every being is dependent. So what I'm going to do instead is draw your attention back to 2.3, which says only contingent beings are dependent. If you combine 2.3 with 2.6, which says there's a being X that's not contingent, and 2.3 says only contingent beings are dependent, you can conclude, therefore, that there is a being X that is not dependent. Why? Well, because you now know that there's a being that's not contingent, and the only beings that are dependent are contingent beings. So I guess that being X is not dependent either. And that was just the conclusion we were trying to argue for, that not every being is dependent. This is the theist's defense of the claim that not every single being is dependent. I'm going to zoom out for just a second and leave this up here for you to copy down in your worksheet, because this is an important bit of the argument. What is going on big picture in this argument is the theist is saying, look, let's consider all of the beings that there are, all of the contingent ones. All of those beings together are contingent. It's contingent that there are any of them. And if it's contingent that there are any of them, then there has to be some explanation for why there are any rather than none. And that explanation can't be just more contingency. So it has to be a non-contingent being. So it has to be something outside that whole collection. And if it's something outside that collection, it can't be dependent either. Therefore, not every being is dependent. Leibniz gives this analogy of a book that's been copied by one monk after another for generations. So a book that one group of monks has copied down carefully, which was itself a copy of a book from a previous generation of monks, which was itself copied from a previous generation of monks, and so on and so on and so on. And Leibniz notes that at each stage in that process, there is in some sense an explanation of where this copy of the book came from. Somebody's like, where'd this come from? You can be like, oh, well, the monks copied it from, an earlier copy. And It's like you sort of explained at least partly where things came from. But it raises just another explanatory question, which is, well, then where did those ones get their copy from? And then you're told, well, there were other monks that had another copy, and they copied that copy and passed that down to the next generation. Again, you've gotten a little bit of progress, but if you keep iterating that that long process of copying and copying and copying and copying, you can zoom out and ask yourself, wait a second, why are there any books at all? And Leibniz says that's a perfectly good question. And it's a question that any curious person would have. And there had better be an answer to it. And the thought is the answer had better come from outside the collection of books. Likewise, you can think of contingent beings as, in some sense, copies of one another. And when you zoom out and look at the whole collection, you can say, well, why are there any contingent beings at all rather than none? And there'd better be an answer outside of the series of contingent beings. And that is a necessary being. That is a being whose existence is guaranteed, a being that would have existed no matter what. Here are a couple of objections to the contingency cosmological argument. The first objection, and I'm going to sort of categorize these two as weaker objections. I think that they both rest on misunderstandings of the argument, and this is why they're weaker. We'll get to a couple of stronger objections in a second. The first objection is a form of the infinite regress objection. Remember when we talked about the first cause argument, we noted that Aquinas says, crucially, he assumes that the series of efficient causes can't be an infinite regress. And when we tried to figure out, well, why does he think that, we came up with not a very good argument. The argument seemed to be circular. And the objection, one might think, applies just as much to this argument. You might be like, well, I didn't see anywhere that the contingency cosmological argument told me why there couldn't be an infinite series of dependent beings. This objection misses the mark as an objection to the contingency cosmological argument. Not because the defender of the contingency cosmological argument gives a reason to think that there can't be an infinite series, but instead because the contingency cosmological argument works regardless of whether there is an infinite regress of dependent beings or not. Part of the virtue of the argument is that it's designed to take into account the possibility that perhaps the series of contingent beings is an infinite regress, such that one contingent being is caused by one prior to it, which is caused by one prior to it, which is caused by one prior to it, and so on ad infinitum. The theist or the defender of this version of that argument will say, suppose that's right. Suppose that's really how things are. You have not answered the following question. Why are there any contingent beings at all? And that question has to be answered because collection C, which is the collection of all contingent things, is itself contingent. In that sense, assuming the PSR, even if there are infinitely many contingent beings stretching backwards into the past for all infinity, there still, given the PSR, has to be something outside that infinitely long series, so to speak, holding it up from underneath. So when I said last time that the contingency cosmological argument bypasses or sidesteps the infinite series objection, this is what I meant. The defender of this argument needn't, unlike Aquinas, say there can't be an infinite series. They can say, even if there were, there still would have to be some divine creator outside that infinitely long series. Okay. here is another objection that you may have heard applied, broadly speaking, to other cosmological arguments. And I think this one is also a bad objection, at least applied to the contingency cosmological argument. And this is the what caused God objection. Now, I'm going to give you a version of this objection and then explain why it misses the mark. The objector says this: look, the PSR says that everything has a cause outside of itself. That's just the idea of the principle of sufficient reason. So what caused God? Right? In other words, the question there is suggesting, well, the theist's argument commits her to the claim that some being must have created or caused God, some being outside of God's self. I mean, isn't that just what the PSR says? If God doesn't have a cause, then the PSR is false. Now, there are versions of the cosmological argument that land the theist in this sort of problem. But the contingency cosmological argument is not one of them. And here's why. I mean, if you look back at the objection says, the PSR says everything has a cause outside of itself. The way we formulated the PSR was very careful. The PSR does not say everything has a cause outside of itself. What it says is every contingent being has a cause outside of itself. Now you might be like, well, that's just special pleading. No, it's not special pleading. The reason why the PSR is restricted to contingency is that contingent beings call out for explanation in a way that the idea of a necessary being doesn't. I mean, think of it this way: a contingent being exists but didn't have to. So the thought is, well, if it exists but didn't have to, then there's got to be something other than it that explains why it is rather than not. But if there were a necessary being, there would be no rather than not for that being, because that being would have existed no matter what. In other words, it doesn't even make a lot of sense to ask, why is the necessary being rather than not? Because what do you mean rather than not? It had to be. So to the extent we can make sense of the question, the answer is, well, because the necessary being is necessary. But I don't actually think that the question makes a lot of sense if formulated as the why is it rather than not. So I think that big picture is the answer to the what caused God objection, or that's the answer that the theist should give if they're defending this version of the cosmological argument. The objection misstates the PSR, and God, if this argument succeeds, is crucially a necessary being. That's the whole point of the argument. And so the PSR does not apply to God, and for good reason, because necessary beings, if there were such things, wouldn't require explanation. Now, this does not mean that the argument succeeds. This version of the argument faces at least two really big objections that I'm going to invite you to think about on your own, puzzle over whether you think that the objections can or can't be overcome, and also maybe talk about them in the discussion thread. The first, what I would consider stronger objection, that is ones that are not based on misunderstandings of the argument, but raise really good points. One is what we'll call the gap problem. And we encountered a version of this with Aquinas, which was, well, even if Aquinas could convince us that there's a first cause, why think that's God? Effectively, this same objection arises for the contingency argument. The atheist or agnostic might be like, okay, you've convinced me there's a necessary being, but I have no reason to think that's God. I mean, the God of classical monotheism, or in particular, the God of Christianity, or the God of Judaism, or the God of Islam. I'd have no reason to think it has any of those characteristics at all. Now, I think this is a big challenge. I think the theist can make a bit of progress in response to it. I don't know if it's enough progress. The first thing to note is that in order to reply to this objection, the theist will have to move beyond what the argument has given them. So in that sense, it's already a big concession to the skeptic. I think the place to think about is this. The argument establishes, if it works, that there's a necessary being. But in the course of doing that, we also can maybe pull some additional threads or some additional conclusions out of, in particular, the defense of the second premise. So remember that being X, that's the being outside the series that causes it to exist. What we know about X is, yes, that it's necessary if it exists. But we can also make some other, educated guesses, so to speak, about its nature. It's not just like a mathematical fact free floating out there. It has to at least have causal powers. And indeed, it has to be extraordinarily creative in the sense that X is a necessary being that created everything else in existence. In that sense, it deserves the title creator, I think. X is also going to be outside the material world because the material world is the domain of contingency. So it is an immaterial creator. And I think in Rowe's sense, it also is a good candidate for being self-existent. That is, it doesn't call out for explanation. It is in that way the sort of foundation of being. Now, that only gets you part of the way, because being a creator, being immaterial, being the foundation of being, those are indeed some really important traditional features of the God of classical theism. But as we'll discuss next time when we introduce the argument from evil, the God of classical theism has, in many ways, some more important properties that don't show up on that list. First and foremost, the God of classical theism is supposed to be a person. It's supposed to be a conscious being. It's supposed to love. It's supposed to, I suppose, sometimes hate. It's supposed to get angry. It's supposed to be happy. It's supposed to have wants and desires for each of its creatures. None of those things show up on that list. Some other qualities of the God of classical theism are, it's supposed to be all-knowing. It's supposed to be perfectly good. It's supposed to be all-powerful. Again, not on our list. So all of that just to say, I think the theist has more work to do. This argument, even if it succeeds, can only get you part way to the existence of God. And the theist then needs to do some thinking about, do they need to supplement this argument with other arguments for God's existence? Or maybe is this the place where something like faith comes in? I leave that for you to think about. The second stronger objection to the argument focuses on the absolutely essential role that the principle of sufficient reason, or PSR, plays in the contingency argument. So the skeptic is going to note, look, both premises of this argument rely on the PSR. So if the PSR is false, then the argument is unsound as a whole. The key claim that some have made is that there are, in fact, counterexamples to the PSR. And a counterexample to the PSR is a single example of a being that is contingent but not dependent on anything outside of it. Any possible counterexample to the PSR is going to be extremely controversial. I'm not going to walk through the details. Some people have claimed that quantum phenomena pose counterexamples to the PSR. I'm not a physicist. I can't really speak to that. I think there are alternative interpretations of the data, from my understanding, that are consistent with the PSR. The one area that I'll just draw your attention to that we as philosophers might be able to make further progress on is, some have claimed that human free decisions or acts of free will are counterexamples to the PSR. Consider your decision about whether to go to UCF or whether to go to, let's say, USF. You picked UCF, obviously, but that decision, or that sort of mental event, which you can think of as a kind of being, not a conscious being, but a fact or an event, that decision is or was contingent. you decided to go to UCF, but you didn't have to. You could have picked USF. Now, some have thought that in order for such a decision to be genuinely free, it has to be not causally dependent on prior factors. We're going to talk more about this when we discuss freedom and determinism. If that view of what freedom is right, then human free decisions are contingent events that do not causally depend on anything outside of themselves. You picked UCF just because you picked it. You could have picked USF. Had you done that, nothing would have inclined you or caused you to do it except your picking. That's a highly controversial view about what free will consists in, as we'll see later in the semester. But if that view of what free will consists in is right, then perhaps free decisions are counterexamples to the PSR. I leave that for you to consider. I also invite you to see if you can come up with your own counterexamples to the PSR. If you can, that would be a very big deal. And I would invite you to write it down and think about it. All right. Hope you enjoyed this. I will see you next time.